This time on Poll Hub, we are 30 days into Trump Act 2, so we're checking in on how he's doing with Americans. He's done more in 30 days than most presidents do in their first year, maybe more than any president has done in their first year in office. But many of the biggest things are surprisingly unpopular, according to two brand new polls. We'll talk about that and how Americans feel about the co-president. I'm half joking, Elon Musk. Then, one of the actions Trump has taken is to call for the release of all the remaining records about the 60s assassinations of JFK, MLK, and RFK. All three of these killings have been caught up in conspiracy theories almost from the moment that each occurred. And we are looking at polling that suggests little has changed. Finally, American Greenland, our fun fact, digs deep into the archives to find out this is not a new idea. Stick around. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm JD Dapper.
I'm Barbara Carvalho. I'm Mary Griffith.
I'm Neil Viswanathan.
And I'm Lee Marigold.
So as this podcast enters your podcasting app of choice, it is 30 days exactly since Donald Trump resumed the presidency, came back to the White House. It's his second term. And as we mentioned, he's done an awful lot in those 30 days. Over 60 executive orders, all of these cabinet choices that continue to have confirmation hearings, many of them already confirmed, very controversial. The proposed annexation and takeover of Greenland, Canada. Did he want Mexico? No. The changing of the name of the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America, Denali to McKinley, lots of things. And of course, the firing of so many federal employees and closing down of departments and organizations within the federal government. So he's been very, very busy. A brand new Emerson poll out suggests that not all of that is popular. In response to Trump vowing to shut down the Department of Ed, for instance, 30% of Americans support that, 58% oppose. In the case of, hey, let's make Greenland part of the U.S., 30% say this is a good idea, 44% oppose. Canada. So he imposed tariffs on Canada, and then he said, hey, it should be the 51st state. People thought it was a joke. He says it again and again and again, and people are beginning to think maybe it's not a joke. Well, only 26% support adding Canada as the 51st state. I actually have a question about that. Wouldn't that add like about 8 states, and that would tip the balance in the Senate? So I don't know if this is a great idea for Republicans. Anyway, 55% oppose that. And finally, one more, and then we'll get to the discussion. We've got a lot more from another poll to talk about as well. The penny, the very popular or unpopular, very collectible anyway, copper penny that's been around since the founding of money in America. He shut down production of it. And 46% support Trump's executive order. And this one, he comes out on top. The 46% say, yep, no more penny. That's probably a good idea. 29% oppose it. So Lee, 30 days in, you've been through a lot of presidential first 30 days. How's he doing?
Well, I think it's interesting that when he was elected, a narrow margin in the popular vote, we all heard about the trifecta, that the Republicans would now have the White House, they would have the Senate, and they would have the House of Representatives. What's interesting in this first 30 days, aside from the confirmation hearings, Congress is pretty dormant in terms of all the things that Donald Trump has done. It's been out of the Oval Office or Mar-a-Lago or wherever, but he's been signing away, holding up the signatures for all to see. And that I find kind of interesting. They wanted to move fast. I think that's a smart thing. While you have whatever momentum you do have and whatever mandate, even if it's not as much as you're claiming, you do have, to start going with the old axiom in politics, say you're going to do it, and say you've done it. I'll add one other point, and I'll let others jump in. The risk of that, of course, is overreach. And that's the downside. And also to do things that can literally become unpopular the minute you do them. So, for example, air traffic controllers and all the crashes we've had, and who's responsible is anybody's guess. He said immediately it was DEI. Obviously, that was not going to be the case, and probably doesn't explain what's been going on generally. Then we also saw, there's been some people who've been let go, hundreds of thousands of people in the federal government. Well, some of them were by mistake, apparently. So the people who handle our nuclear weaponry system, apparently they were let go. Now they got to get them back. The people who are monitoring the bird flu potential epidemic were also let go, and now they're scrambling to get them back. So there's a little bit of overreach in some areas. The net effect is, when you look at the numbers, a lot of things aren't all that popular, and most of the numbers he has in terms of his overall approval are sort of like mid-40s. And that starts to become a familiar number because when he left office, he was around 40. And that seems to be the number incumbents have. And he's kind of gravitating down from the number he got in November to a mid-40s number. And, that at some point those numbers get a little shaky for him. So I think it's been an awful lot. I think it's been right out of his playbook. And it's playing to not even mixed reviews. In many cases, it's playing to negative reviews.
Well, what I found interesting in both of these polls, and in the YouGov poll, the president's negative rating is 48%. And in the Emerson poll, the president's positive rating is 48%, which if you even look at the positive and negatives in both of these polls, yeah, he's kind of like half and half. It looks very much like the election in November. And I think that's very interesting because it has been an incredibly active first month. But I also think that, we talk about the honeymoon period in any first couple months in office. And I think these numbers also show that, at least for his supporters, they are giving him that moment to kind of wait and see how things go. I mean, I think we're talking about things that have been very controversial. And Lee, you talk about Congress really kind of just, ducking the whole discussion. But these are things that have been incredibly controversial in Congress. And I think from the perspective of conservative Republicans, they have wanted the Republicans in Congress to be much more active and supportive of many of the things that both Trump and Musk are doing right now. But they never felt that they could go on the record, take a vote, and then still win re-election. As we see with the Department of Ed, that's a very controversial move. People don't know what it means. Education is still something that is highly valued, particularly when we think of monies that go to local school. So in a sense, it may not be quite so surprising that a Republican Congress is kind of just taking also a wait and see attitude about this, because this has been on their agenda for so many years. And if we look at Project 2025, which was a discussion point early on in the presidential campaign, this is a blueprint for action. And one thing Americans do want, they may not want everything, but they do want action.
So, Barb, you and I have had a discussion on this podcast ongoing since the election about the role of the economy and issues in general in what voters did. And I think there's something really interesting in the Economist YouGov poll that is out this week. There's more opposition than support for Trump on his handling of things like climate, health, abortion, guns. It's not a surprise. But listen to these three, and then let's talk about the economy, because the perception is that is the most important issue during the election and remains the most important issue. He is 7 points underwater in his handling of inflation and prices. 41% approve, 48% disapprove. He's 3 points under on taxes and government spending. I mean, that's Musk, right? 44-47. And he's barely ahead, 45-44 on jobs on the economy. So all that stuff, all these things that he's doing that are controversial, the bread and butter, he's behind on. What does that mean? What does that say?
I think one of the things that though is interesting is people, though, in that same poll are still generally optimistic, or at least on the fence about what the future holds. So I think it really speaks to the fact that he's being given this moment in time. But at some point, there is a suggestion, and I don't know, he has been different in terms of public opinion, in terms of his ability to be able to engender support. Look, Reagan did it in the midterms in the 1980s. He took over after Carter, and there was horrendous inflation, which he could blame on the previous administration for a very long time. The economy had tanked, and he came to the midterm elections, and he just asked Americans, hold the course, stay with me, give me a little bit more time. So I think many Americans are willing to give him that time. They think their personal finances are going to be better. They think the economy is going to get better. Granted, they do think inflation is going to continue to rise, But right now, that doesn't get laid at Trump's doorstep.
Hey, Lee, can we talk about Elon Musk real quick? The Economist YouGov asked about a couple things about Elon. Do you disapprove or approve of the way that he's handling the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE? 47% disapprove, 38% approve. So 9-point gap there. This is where it gets interesting. So do you think Elon Musk, how much influence do you think he has? So this is the question of perception. Do you think he has a lot, a little, none at all, not sure? So 63% say the perception is he's got a lot. Another 26% say he's got a little. So I don't think there's any question. Americans think, yeah, this guy's doing a lot. How much influence do you want Elon Musk to have within Donald Trump's administration? 18% say a lot, 26% say a little, 45%, nearly half say none at all. So is this kind of perceived co-presidency thing, is this going to be a problem for Donald Trump? And knowing Donald Trump, how much longer does Elon Musk have if that is the case?
Well, if he looked at the cover of Time magazine, which I'm sure he did, and he saw Elon Musk sitting at the Resolute desk and Trump in the background, I think that speaks to what he thinks of a co-presidency. Right now, Elon Musk was tremendously useful during the campaign for him and other Republicans. Obviously, he's no limit to the amount of money he can put into the thing. And right now, I think Trump sees him as a net plus until he doesn't. And at some point, that has been the course during the first term with Donald Trump and other people who tried to have a lot of power. Right now, just because Trump is saying, I love Musk, he's wonderful, doesn't mean he can't do a 180 on him. And,
he's been there for two Scaramucci's, to reference your...
Yes, as it were. So I think, in a sense, because he is so important in the administration, he is also can be someone who can take the fall if things don't go well. And I know you guys were talking just a few moments ago about the blame game and on the economy and Trump having required to do things about it. And just, I think it was yesterday, the day before, he's talked about inflation is back, which I'm not sure when it ended, but it appears to be back. And Biden's the culprit. And I recall, and so the question is, how long can you play that blame game? And Trump is very good. But the question becomes, for me, I remember in 2009, Obama elected ostensibly because the economy was really in trouble and the crash in 2008, was able to ride it's Bush's economy for a better part of a year and a half. I mean, he was not seen as the one responsible for a long, long time. Now, the thing about Donald Trump, and if we want to sum up the 30 days, it has been 3 major news stories a day. And I know you guys in journalism can speak to, what does that do? Well, it keeps things, keeps you guessing, keeps you moving, doesn't let you have time to digest anything while he's on to the next story already. That's not an accident. I think it's part of moving quickly, but also it's moving quickly in a lot of different places, including now Ukraine, which seems to be a turnabout for him as well.
So another of President Trump's executive actions pertains to declassifying the files and records relating to the assassinations of former President John F. Kennedy, Senator Robert F. Kennedy, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So first, let's take a look at some numbers about whether or not, just in general, independent of President Trump's actions, whether or not Americans agree with declassifying these records. And according to an Ipsos Reuters poll, 72% of Americans either strongly or somewhat support the declassification of these records. However, do Americans think that the actions surrounding these assassinations are or were conspiracy theories, or conspiracies rather? Let's take a look at the assassination of President John F. Kennedy and public opinion surrounding that tragic event. In order to do that, we need to take a walk back in time over the last 60 or so years. So first and foremost, according to a December 2023 YouGov poll, 54% of Americans believe that Lee Harvey Oswald did not act alone in the assassination of JFK. Of course, there are partisan differences here, with 68% of Republicans saying this compared with 40% of Democrats. However, public opinion on JFK's assassination has stayed relatively consistent over the decades. Now, Newark asked the first question related to the conspiracy in November of 1963, and here what they found was that 24% said that JFK's assassination was the work of a lone gunman, while 62% said that other people were involved in his assassination. 12 years later, fast forward to 1975, A Lewis Harris and Associates poll found that 65% of Americans thought that the assassination was part of a larger conspiracy. And just as an aside, in that same poll, 55% of Americans said that more than one person, rather, was involved in the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy. And 60% thought the same of the MLK assassination. Now, again, let's fast forward here to 2003. In a Fox News poll, they asked registered voters a similar question, and they found that 25% and 66%, respectively, thought that there was a conspiracy theory surrounding the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And in April of 2013, an AP JFK Roper poll said that 59% said they thought the JFK assassination was the work of one or more person. Now, Lee, you and I have had conversations about the events that took place in the 1960s many, many times. What's your thought on this?
Well, I think part of it is because the initial Warren Commission, which was established by then became President Lyndon Johnson, really didn't put to bed a lot of the questions people had. And there was a lot of books and the like coming out, which seemed to give some credence to the argument that Oswald did not act alone. And then we come into a period where conspiracies are even more popular. And so, this is that it lends itself. It was never fully shut down. And contributing to that was the fact that the government was not releasing all the documents, implying or suggesting that there's still something there and that there's things that are missing. It may be no more than when we do finally get that to see the documents, so all of them, that maybe the FBI was monitoring and tracking Oswald and therefore looked bad because they didn't track him all the way. I mean, that may be all that's there without there being some, major conspiracy involving the CIA, Lyndon Johnson, organized crime. I mean, it's been every group has gotten their time in the conspiracy view. So there's no doubt that there was a lot of things that were left uncovered and not a lot of things that remained out of sight, including in the case of Martin Luther King. I mean, James Earl Ray, those questions of, how did he get to do it? Where did he get the gun? How did he get to London? Immediately afterwards, in other words, how did he get out of the clutches of the law enforcement? There's a whole bunch of questions about that. Again, never put to rest, never really convincingly put to rest so people could say that's the end of the story.
Well, the more things change, the more things stay the same. And what we saw in a 2024 Quinnipiac poll is that 44% of Americans say that they hear conspiracy theories either very or somewhat often. So the idea of conspiracy theories being present now 60 some odd years later, really still around.
I am quite frankly amazed that we have had six decades since the assassination of President Kennedy, and the numbers stay pretty much about the same. I mean, this is generational change. Mm-hmm. I mean, we're talking about, most of the folks that are answering these polls in 2023 only read about this, in history books or heard about this from history. So I just find it really fascinating that you can have this kind of consistency. In fact, I'm not even sure there's another issue that you can look at in public opinion that has this kind of consistency over the generations and over the decades. Even some of the most basic, founding values of our democracy don't have that kind of consensus and consistency. So on the one hand, I think it's really interesting that President Trump is going to kind of open up, and make this all, very transparent, although who knows how much will be removed from this document.
Stuff will be redacted also where names are present. So again, we're going to get more of the loaf, but not the full loaf.
But still, I think it really speaks to the fact that most of us really do have a tendency to believe and want to believe something that we can't explain. And that's really what conspiracy theories are about. It's about having something where all the facts are not known and really people filling in the blanks without that kind of knowledge. And we all have a tendency to want to fill in those gaps. In fact, when we do look at conspiracy theory research, we find that about at least half of Americans strongly believe in at least one conspiracy theory. And there are so many. I think the danger here is that conspiracy theories really undermine trust, and they also undermine authority and in science. But Neil, I want to bring you in. Our student put together the topics that we discuss on the podcast. And Neil, this was your interest. So you talk about what intrigued you about this topic.
Yeah, so when I was looking through all of Trump's executive orders, I kind of saw this one as, like, I wasn't a fan of all of Trump's executive orders, but I found this as one that I can somewhat get behind almost, because it's like, whether you believe in the conspiracy theories or whether you don't believe in the conspiracy theories, I feel like bringing out the truth, like, might not do a ton of public social harm. But I also found it interesting because JFK was, I was obviously never alive during his presidency, but I always thought of him as a very well-approved president. Like, his retroactive approval rate is 90%. And I guess that's why I always found his assassination pretty shocking, because, like, the only assassination attempt that I've been alive for is Trump. And I feel like it wasn't, like, wild when I heard that he would be assassinated, because he was, not that he's like a wildly unpopular president in America, but his approval rate has almost always been under 50%. So I think that shock factor always kind of interested me about JFK's assassination, and I think that's why, like, it hit, like, the older generation so hard, because everyone always says that they remember where they were when they heard about JFK's assassination. And I just found that shock factor very interesting, because I feel like with the Trump assassination attempt, there wasn't really that same shock factor.
Yeah, well, I think in part, I think you're right, and on part was because it wasn't in our vision at all that this, we weren't totally not thinking a political assassination. It wasn't, on our wavelength. And so when it did happen, it was stunning and shocking, as you say.
So Neil, how did you learn about the assassination of President Kennedy? Is this something that you kind of heard from family members, or mostly in school, or you just had an interest in reading about it?
Yeah, I just mostly learned about it in school and on my own, because my parents, they weren't even alive when JFK was assassinated. So I didn't hear a lot about it at home, but I'm an American Studies major, so history, like, I'm very interested in history. So, like I said, like, that shock factor in history is very intriguing to me, and, like, especially the conspiracy part of it, because with that high retroactive approval rating, or retrospective rather, but also his pretty high, like, approval rating during his presidency, like, it's kind of logical to me that these conspiracy theories would pop up. So I guess that's why I've always just been interested, because it's something that also crosses party lines. Like, the statistic we mentioned, that 40% of Democrats also believe that Lee Harvey Oswald didn't act alone, even though Republicans are shown to be more likely to believe conspiracy theories. So I found that very interesting.
Jay, as someone in a journalistic background, I'm going to put you on the spot. What do your instincts tell you about all these conspiracies from days gone by? Do you instinctively feel there's any there? And when the report on the Kennedy assassination is finally released, assuming it is or will be, are you going to go through it real quick and see, take a dig, or do you think it's nothing there?
So speaking of conspiracy theories, if there's a deep state, this is where the deep state's going to make sure that nothing comes out in these reports that shows that there was some implication of the government or government officials in any of these assassinations.
There you have a conspiracy theory.
Right. So, I just don't. There is evidence of this, for instance, in the CIA's experiments with dosing people with LSD, and how those records were hidden for long periods. I just, look, it's a conspiracy theory to say, yeah, they're never going to release the truth if the truth is that. I'm not saying the truth is that, but I do think that there's very little chance that these records are, whatever is released is going to shed any light. The thing that interests me is that in this most recent polling, there's one number in here about how much Americans are concerned about conspiracy theories, and I don't think they're thinking about the conspiracy theories around these assassinations. I think they're thinking about the conspiracy theories that have taken up our time recently, which are very, very different, about very different things, and have largely emanated from our politics, from our conservative side of politics. But I think it's really interesting that a majority of Americans think that big majority of Americans think it's a big problem. conspiracy theories in our politics. And I think that's something to think about as these, whatever gets released, that 60-year-old conspiracy theories stick around, but the most modern ones are the ones that are concerning Americans the most right now.
Well, earlier on, we were talking about Greenland and how Donald Trump's suggestion that this may be something we want to purchase, which kind of caught a lot of people off guard, but apparently not the people at Gallipola in 1947 who asked the question whether we should or should not purchase Greenland. And apparently the reason for that way back when was in 1946 was that, there might be a military necessity. Not unlike the explanation or rationale Donald Trump offered recently. But in 1947, do you think the United States should or should not buy Greenland for $1 billion? And the answer was should was 33%, should not 38%, and 28% had no opinion. So this wasn't a hot button issue then, and I suspect it isn't now either. But it's certainly something that was on the wavelengths way back in 1947.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, World War II had just ended. Greenland strategically, particularly for shipping lanes, is located in a very enviable place. So I think certainly in 1947, that was probably a real concern. Also, I think if Americans were going to have an outpost on Greenland, it would give them access to other areas around the globe that would be very significant, and they were concerned about during that time. We're just about to go into the Cold War. Although, we had been allies with Russia in World War II, that was more of a relationship of convenience than one that was going to be sustainable. And as the decades followed, that was our focus, to protect Americans and, other folks around the globe, from communism and Russia. So it was very strategic in a number of different ways. I think it's surprising now because we really hadn't given much thought to it. And it hasn't really been on the radar for the last almost 80 years. And so I think, we're kind of talking generationally on other issues. I think generationally, this hasn't been something that has been discussed, but certainly has come back into the public debate.
I mean, it's worth noting that we have air bases there, and we have a deal from the 50s at the height of the Cold War with Denmark, which, controls Greenland. So there's been this kind of long-term interest in Greenland. And to me, this is kind of the core of Donald Trump. And I'm not saying this is a criticism, he very much sees the world of, say, 1950 or 1955 or 1945, this era as that's when America was great, when he was basically a kid. And so many of the things that he has talked about are things that kind of revert to a past that he remembers. And so the idea of taking over Greenland, which was at least in circulation, there was some talk about it, there was defense deals about getting bases on Greenland, it kind of makes sense to him, to bring back this kind of proposal, if you'll call it, from a period that he very much seems to revere.
And geopolitically, we're in a change era in Europe, with NATO, with Ukraine, with the Putin-Trump alliance, for lack of a better word. So maybe Greenland is, dare I say, back on the map as kind of like the west of Europe as opposed to the east. But
then, I think geopolitical strategy is very different in the 21st century than it was in the 20th century. And technologically, this kind of thought process doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense to generations who have followed. But, in military terms, as you're playing Risk around the globe, I think, as you said, Greenland's back on the map.
One thing I think is interesting about this whole Greenland thing is that when Trump talks about it, he doesn't only talk about purchasing Greenland. He talks about acquiring it, but he doesn't always just say purchase. This fun fact in the 40s talks about purchasing Greenland, but Representative Buddy Carter, he proposed the Red, White, and Blue Land Act renaming Greenland to Red, White, and Blue Land. And in that act, he said that he believes President Trump should purchase or otherwise acquire the territory, which I personally feel might be slightly concerning, the second half of that, because especially considering Denmark doesn't willingly want to give Greenland up, and despite like what Trump's saying, it really has no intention to. Yeah, so I just think that I find
would
that
you be okay with it if we
concerning.
bought it though, and they wanted to sell it?
If they wanted to sell it, I would feel much. I don't know if I
I mean,
would.
we bought Alaska, right?
Yeah.
Seward's folly turned out to be not a folly. So,
Mhm.
I mean, if Denmark wanted to sell it and we wanted to buy it, I mean, no.
Well, I would say I'm much more in favor than the otherwise acquire.
So the invasion of Greenland by U.S. troops is not on your to-do list. That's good. I think that's probably a positive sign. Neil, we've
trying to get
we've
this
trained
back
you
to-
well here at Marist.
I'm trying to get this back to the fun fact, but I have no segue back from. And I think by introducing this as a geopolitical phenomena, probably douse that one. I'm just guessing, but we can leave it there and pick it up next week. I'll probably find a little bit more fun in the fun fact, even though I've been accused, that I can find politics and everything. This was kind of easy, though.
That'll do it for Poll Hut this week.
Poll Hub is produced by the Marist Poll at Marist University in Poughkeepsie, New York.
Mary Griffith is our executive producer. Casey Schaff is our production supervisor.
The Poll Hub team includes Hunter Petro and Neil Viswanathan.
If you enjoy Poll Hub, please consider leaving a review.
Positive reviews help other listeners like you find us.
If you'd like to learn more about polling and survey science, check out the Marist Poll Academy, our free online learning portal.
If you have questions for us, tweet them at us at Marist Poll.
Remember, you can always tell your smart speaker to play Poll Hub.
And with any luck, it'll cooperate.
Finally, wherever you listen to Poll Hub, there is a subscribe button.
Click it, and the latest episode will be ready for you in your podcasting app as soon as it's released.
We'll see you next time.